Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
It's a great pleasure and privilege to have a chance to talk to John Dunn, who, among other things, I owe my fellowship at King's to many years ago. So, John, when and where were you born?
I was born in Buckinghamshire in 1940 in a place called Fulmer Hospital, because my mother was staying with friends and my father was in the army.
Tell me something about your parents or your grandparents, or however far back you want to go.
Well, it probably is potentially relevant to go back a bit. I mean, my family was a sort of imperial family. My father came from sort of British ascendancy in Ireland, not a grand bit of it, but a sort of appropriative bit still. His mother came from Staffordshire, so she isn't part of the story particularly, but the other bits all are. My grandfather was an army doctor, and he was, for example, he was at the Battle of Undergraduate, and he fought in the First World War and was sort of decorated and drastically injured and so on. And my father was also a career soldier, of a rather lazy and self-indulgent kind. And my mother's family was also, my mother came from a Highland Scottish family, but her grandfather and father both lived a large proportion of their lives in India. Her father was a planter and was actually killed when she was about...
Tea planter?
Yes. Was killed when she was about 13 years old by a wild boar that some guest of his was wounded, and he crawled, I mean, as it were, gallantly but unwisely into a thicket to deal with it, and it dealt with him. So, and both my mother met my father on a southern Indian estate, very, very far up in the hills.
In the Nilgiris, was this?
Sorry?
The Nilgiri Hills, was this?
Yes, that's right. When she was staying with her elder sister, I mean, after this affair with the wild boar, when she was in her sort of late teens, I suppose. And they spent quite a lot of time in India before the war, and that my father actually managed to go back to India in the 1950s as a sort of pseudo-diplomat. And I mean, his main enthusiasm in life was really the destruction of wildlife, and the sort of larger and more dangerous, the better. So
it was trying to get back at the wild boar.
They were, in a sense, the empire in that, I mean, rather dense and in practical respect, I mean, was really their world, and they never completely came back from it. I suppose my father must have lived something like half his life altogether in the British Isles, but his sort of heart wasn't there, and he was always trying to get out of it. I mean, to do other things, and to be in different sorts of places. I really grew up, I mean, thinking about politics in reaction to their vision of the world, and in a sense trying to articulate my disbelief in it, really, I suppose. And my interest in politics came from trying to understand not so much why they saw and felt about the world in the way they did, but why it seemed to me so misguided to think about it the way they did. I couldn't. Their feelings were their feelings, and I didn't mind about theirs. But I did think that the picture of the picture of human reality which had come out of their experience was wildly misguided, and I was trying to see how to sort of fix and express, a vision which I thought was more like reality.
At what age did you start feeling that this is what you were trying to do? I mean, as a child, did you already question their...
I suppose I really started doing so in early adolescence, and it was all bound up with being the sort of school I was at. But it was also, my father was, his first escape from military life was when he went to Iran as military attaché in the embassy, and he was there at the time the oil fields were nationalised. So I went out to Iran a couple of times in late childhood. It was a very politically hectic time, and that sort of caught my attention. But I didn't much understand what was going on, really, just as well. When he went back again into diplomatic life, he did so in a sense as a result of associations he formed during that period. And he went, and he was very keen to go back to India. He was there for about 3 or 4 years in the 1950s, and I went out to stay with him in the first instance quite briefly, holidays, but then I became very depressed at school and I had to go away from it for a bit, and it wasn't convenient really to go anywhere else, so I went out and stayed with them for a bit, and then I fell off a horse and broke my back, so I couldn't go back to school very promptly. So I spent about a year and a half.
Broke your back?
Yes, one of the vertebrae. Not a clever thing to have done. I wasn't very good at riding horses. It's a very disagreeable horse.
What age was this? When did you go out?
I must have gone out first of all when I was 14, and then I went out again when I was 15 and stayed out for about a year. A year and a half altogether.
Were either of them interested in ideas, in books, in reading?
My mother was quite literate, but and my father collected books, but he collected books about the destruction of very large and preferably dangerous wildlife. He had a rather outstanding library about that, but which after he died was sold for some money, so in a way it was actually an investment, but it didn't look like it at the time. It wasn't meant as such, I think. But my mother did read, she read sort of serious fiction, but she stopped being educated at the age of 13, so in a way, she had the whole, what I would have thought of as most of the content of intellectual life was denied to her, and the circles in which they moved, didn't pay a great deal of attention to it either. And I suppose part of the causation of my ending up with such different preoccupations was just the accident of where my preparatory school sent me off to take a scholarship exam, and the first one on their list was Winchester, and I got a scholarship to Winchester, and the college at Winchester was a very different sort of imaginative milieu from my family. So I adjusted to that, perhaps slightly over-adjusted to it, but I did adjust to it anyway.
Did you have any brothers and sisters?
I had a younger brother. I have a younger brother, about 4 years younger.
What did he do?
Well, he sort of dithered around really in one way or another. He was, after coming to Cambridge, he came to King's, in fact, he's at Kingsland too. He went into an American bank, into Citibank, but he decided that after all he didn't want to do that. And, so he left that very promptly and did a brief sort of pseudo postgraduate period at the University of Pennsylvania, doing nothing in particular, I think. Then he came back and he went into the Foreign Office, and he was in that for a bit in Germany and in Malaysia. And I think he quite liked Malaysia, didn't great state of Germany. And then he left that for a merchant bank from Morgan Grenfell, then at its sort of scandalous peak. He was in that for a bit, and then he failed in some sort of promotion struggle and left it in a peak. And he's done various sorts of sort of jobs in of differeng degrees of formality in the financial sector since then. I think he's just about retired too now, but very, very recently.
Your first school, your preparatory school, was that a boarding school? Or
Yes, it was.
Where was that?
It was in Gloucestershire, in Cirencester.
Was it a reasonable experience? Do you remember it or not?
It was very disagreeable in many ways, and I didn't like being away from my parents all the time. Anyway.
Were they abroad at that time?
Yes.
So you were sent home to this preparatory school?
Yes. I think I probably went to it before they went abroad, but I certainly felt more adhesively in it while they were that far away, certainly. It was run by a headmaster who was a rather sadistic figure, and but very passionate about history. And I had a sort of edgy relationship with him because I enjoyed the passion about history and feared the sadism. So it wasn't a very steady and comfortable relationship. But he wasn't. It wasn't a bad school. I mean, the teaching was quite good, in fact. And I think the level of neglect no worse than normal.
Were you either there or at Winchester interested in games or music or any other kind of activity, drama or?
I was quite keen on drama, and we had a bit of that at both of those. And I guess if I'd gone on at Winchester till the end instead of having this hiatus in the middle in India, I might have gone on with the drama much more seriously. I mean, I liked that, and I wasn't hopeless at it anyway.
At Winchester, were you? I mean, when you went out, you had a hiatus, but then you went back to Winchester, presumably?
No, I didn't go back to Winchester because by the time I came back again, it was relatively close to the time at which I needed to try and get into Oxford or Cambridge or wherever. And I went to a really rather frightful school in Somerset, just because it
Did you say frightful school?
Yes.
Disaster after disaster.
It was a school called Millfield. I mean, it was very, very expensive, but it was sort of only ordinarily expensive for me because the headmaster was very competitive, and he sort of mostly liked people who might turn out to be Olympic athletes, but he was also keen on people who might win Oxford scholarships, and he thought that perhaps I might win one of those. So, the fees were cut a bit for that. It was a dreadful school, educationally speaking, and its goals were beneath contempt. But it did have one or two rather dashing teachers in it, and one of the teachers, I think, had some impact on me. He was a playwright, and subsequently, I suppose, best known for his film scripts, a man called Robert Belt.
The famous Robert Bolt.
Yes, the famous Robert Bolt.
Hmm.
I used to go and have supervisions with him on how to write, or usually how not to write. And I made friends with him. I became quite a close friend because
He was at Cambridge, I think, as far as I remember. But
I don't know, actually. I thought it was Manchester or something like that. But I mean, he was a striking figure.
Hmm.
He was very striking.
Were you beginning to concentrate now down onto arts and humanities, as they call them now?
Well, I never sort of got out of the arts or humanities, I'm afraid. I mean, I never did any science at all. I did one term of the history of chemistry and one term of the history of physics at Winchester. And they were quite good as such, but I mean, that was a very thin education. I mean, I didn't actually mean to come to Cambridge myself. If I'd been left to me, I would have gone to Keele, because the professor of education there came round and gave a lecture in the school, it was at Millfield, and explained the Keele Foundation year, in which those who had gross educational lacunae would be made to sort of try to make them up in the first year. And I thought, well, that's the thing for me. It exactly suits me. So I said I was going to go there, and they said, well, you know, no, you're not, actually. Or anyway, before you go there, you have first to take the King's and Balliol scholarship exams, and then we'll see. You see what I mean?
Was this your parents or the school, really?
No, it was the school. My parents didn't really have any opinions about such things. I mean, they were very pleased that I got a scholarship to Winchester because it paid most of the fees. But they, and they were told it was a good scholarship to get, so they were pleased about that too. I mean, they weren't deranged. Just they weren't really interested in these questions. And they were pleased when I got a scholarship to King's, but for roughly the same sorts of reasons. And they had no sense at all of what it meant, actually, to come to an institution like this.
Did you get a scholarship to Balliol as well, or?
The King's one came first. No, they didn't. That school didn't make me go and do the other one.
Who interviewed? Oh, I mean, you came up for an interview, did you? Do you remember the interview at all?
I remember one of the interviews very well. Yes, it was the tutorial interview. I've completely lost the history of the interview. Perhaps I'm glad to say. But anyway, the tutorial interview was with John Raven and John Broadbent, very dramatically assorted pair. And John Raven was extremely stiff and shy, and I was, for all sorts of different good reasons and bad, pretty stiff and shy too. So it was a very, 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 very slow interview. It had almost no content until a point very late on, and I was sort of afflicted with more or less total amnesia over any pertinent aspects of my education. And I was being interrogated by John Broadbent about my reading, and I couldn't read anything. I never read in my life, so it wasn't going well. And then after, John Broadbent was very tall, and he lay back in his chair until he was more or less on the floor from one end to the other. It was a very low chair, and trying to put me at my ease, conspicuously failing. But anyway, after what seemed forever, that probably was only a few minutes, I suddenly remembered a book, not only that I had read, but that I actually was reading, which was an Angus Wilson novel called Anglo-Saxon Attitudes. Not a bad book, really, and quite fun. And I remembered just simply propositionally that was the book I was reading. I didn't remember the content of it at all, but I did acknowledge that I was reading this book. And John Broadbent said, well, what do you think of it? Reasonable enough interviewing question. But of course I couldn't answer it because I had no content at all that was suitable for an answer. So I havered desperately and said, I keep on feeling I've met characters from it. And at that point he lay at back so that he was more or less penetrating the floor, and he said, "You must have a very interesting circle of acquaintance." And of course, at that point, I then recaptured totally.
I thought he was going to say that, and I was one of them. No, I'm not. I did mention in passing music. I mean, I often ask people whether they ever get a deep interest or love of music. Has music meant much to you or not?
Well, it does mean quite a lot to me now, really, and I suppose I first started to become susceptible to it at Winchester because I mean, there were a lot of very musical people in college at Winchester, and they played a lot of music, and some of them became some of my contemporaries became very eminent musicologists. So I sort of heard music around me at that point, and started to respond to it. And I suppose it made a big difference coming here, just simply because it is a very musically resonant space that live in over time. But I never tried to play an instrument or anything, and I can't sing, and I don't really focus of it. So I've never done it in any sense. But I spent quite a lot of time listening to it, and I suppose I'm sort of hoping I'll spend more now.
Is it the great classics that you like most?
Yes, I'm afraid it's not very conventional. I mean, I like the opera very much, but opera I really like is 18th and the first half of the 19th century. Late Verdi too, but that's the chronological centre of gravity of it. And then a bit earlier, but I mean not very much later. And I'm not really interested in 20th century music, 21st century music. I like some of it, but I don't yearn to hear it, whereas I do hear very often hear Mozart and Bach. Yeah, too.
I've asked you about sport. You've never been interested in.
No, I've never really. So I quite like playing some of the things you could play at Winchester. I like playing fives and squash a bit, but I like playing tennis. But it's never meant anything serious to me.
What about God? I mean, late teens is often a time when you.
Well, God was quite important for me in the Winchester context because Winchester wasn't a very religiously responsive school, really, but it was an Anglican school, and if you were a Catholic or a Jew, you weren't expected to participate in the Anglican side of it. But if you weren't a Catholic or a Jew, or I suppose a Muslim or that, I don't think there were any contemporaries there who were Muslims. But anyway, you would have been exempted on that basis. I mean, but it was assumed otherwise that you would you were an Anglican and you would be confirmed as such. I mean, not all that long after you arrived in the school, so the time came round for that to occur. And I said, I'm afraid I can't do that because I don't actually believe it. And I hadn't come to this conclusion 5 years earlier, but it's sort of, the conclusion had crept up on me. And it was clear that this was a point in which you either had to ignore the fact that it had crept up on you, or to say, well, I'm afraid I'm sort of stepping off the escalator at this point. And they were very, very perturbed by this. I mean, they said it hadn't actually ever happened before. I still believe that's true, actually, but anyway, perhaps it wasn't true, and they knew it wasn't true. But anyway, that's what they said to me. And I had to see various people, going up the hierarchy, because it's never happened before. It wasn't at all a proper thing to have happen. And I ended up talking to the headmaster, Walter Oakeshott, subsequently head of one of the Oxford houses.
The political philosopher?
No,
that was Michael.
No. Actually, I think a sort of medieval historian. I explained to each of them, I mean, why I couldn't say what the catechism said he was supposed to say, and they sucked their teeth and tried to persuade me in different ways. And actually, even my father tried to persuade me. Probably the most emotionally exposing, from his point of view, conversation we ever had was actually about that, because he, I mean, on that occasion, he felt that he knew something I didn't know, but which was tremendously important and which was directly pertinent to this issue. And he was in the artillery, and he was, as I explained, I mean, he was a very rash person, and he did, I mean, deliberately very dangerous things, I mean, with gusto. So he wasn't, certainly wasn't, as it were, a physical coward. And what he explained to me was that he was in the D-Day landings, and what he explained to me was that if you hadn't actually personally been subjected to modern artillery bombardment, you couldn't begin to imagine how absolutely appalling it was, and you couldn't really understand what it would mean for it to be in such completely appalling circumstances. You couldn't get the significance of that. And the significance of that, from his point of view, was that actually God wasn't an option. I mean, God was required, really. And I was a bumptious little twerp, obviously, in lots of ways. Winchester was a very intellectually pretentious institution. So I really knew that that wasn't the right sort of reason for the sort of action I was being asked to perform. So it didn't affect me at all. But it did move me, because it was such an honest and, I mean, in a way, sort of self-humbling thing for him to do. Comes back to me quite often, that. I mean, it's certainly one of the most evocative interactions that we've had. But anyway, I said, look, I'm not going to do it. I didn't say it to him, but I said to them, look, I'm not going to do it. I mean, this is ridiculous. So it's not going to happen. So they said, all right, it's not.
You haven't changed your mind since?
No, I haven't changed my mind since. I mean, I'm sort of quite Humean, really, about the matter, I think. I mean, I think if you think about it, it doesn't really make any sense. And, you know, it's... I'm very interested in my sort of vanishing historical capacity. I mean, I'm very interested in how religious belief works and what it's meant. I mean, I take it very, very seriously, but it's not my belief. And it's not really a belief I could conceive of sharing, I think. I mean, I just have to remove almost the entire structure through which I believe things if I were to do so. So it's just not an option at all. And I suppose I'd recognise that when I was 13, which is why this interaction occurred.
If you had to take the binary choice between being described as an agnostic or an atheist, I mean, Hume was pressed, as you know, right to the grave as to make up his mind. It's difficult. I mean, he's sort of a deistic, agnostic-ish. He didn't know that God didn't exist, but what would you be your... Is it just...
Well, if I wasn't thinking about it, I would say I was an atheist, but of course it is true that actually it's not all that clear what it means to say you're an atheist, and if you do think about it very carefully, you might say, well, probably the more intellectually prudent answer is to say I'm an extremely robustly agnostic.
Yes. When you came to King's, did you do national service between or anything?
No.
You were just after that period?
Missed it.
Just missed it. So you must have come up in about 1959.
I came up in 1959.
The year before I went to Oxford. Who you did history, so was Christopher Morris your...
Christopher Morris gave me half the supervisions I had as an undergraduate.
Yes.
With extremely little net profit, I guess.
Well, Christopher and I shared these rooms for many years. Tell me something about Christopher. I mean,
Well, he was a nice man. I liked Christopher, but he was, as the Ghanaians say, a hopeless. I mean, as a teacher of history, I mean, he just didn't understand what was involved in teaching history to people who were disposed to think for themselves and not clear that they had to pay much intellectual attention to the subject. I mean, he just didn't have any way at all of conveying the point of studying it convincingly to anyone else at that point. And he also just didn't have much didactic competence, really. I mean, it was the tripos. It was very much more shaped in those days. It had a lot of compulsory bits. And he didn't really know how to teach any of the bits from a professional point of view, even then, in my view. I mean, he obviously knew more about Tudors, and actually the bits on Tudors were much more fun. I enjoyed those much more. But even those were very sort of nebulous cognitively. I mean, nothing in particular was really going on. We never really got anywhere. And I didn't really think I could face up to going on doing history. I mean, after about halfway through the first year, and Christopher was teaching me in the first year. I don't know quite what would have happened if I had stayed. I tried in a desultory way to switch to philosophy, but philosophy didn't show great zest for acquiring me, so that took quite a long time. By the time that they made up their mind that they would, as it were, on sufferance, which I thought was painfully insulting, and I thought, well, maybe I will jolly well do it in that case, just to show them. But I started going to one or two lectures which actually meant something to me. I went to some of Postman's lectures, which were very exciting and very vigorous and very sort of intellectually alive.
These were the medieval,
yes.
on medieval economic history.
Yes.
Anyone else?
Well, there were sort of better and worse lectures in that first year. I went to some of David Nells's lectures, and that was very wonderful to listen to. I mean, it was sort of almost a spiritual experience. In fact, if it had been religiously susceptible, I'm sure it would have been a spiritual experience. But it was lovely, and it was like going to a really good concert. And there were other people who lectured in a spirited way, so I got a bit out of some people's lectures. But I didn't really switch in very energetically, except to Potsdam until the second year. And in a way, even with Potsdam, I think I did, because I read one or two pieces of his writing first, and I started to sort of see how you could think history. And it was. I could see that if you could think it, I might be able to do it. I couldn't understand, I mean, what it was to think it before then, and Christopher, I mean, wasn't really helping me to at all. But in the second year, I had one very close friend who was also reading history, Michael Cook, now a well-known Islamicist, and Michael's father was a professor of ancient history, and after the first year, when both of us got firsts, he, just by fluke really, I mean by Potsdam in my case, reproducing Potsdam and thought processes, he said, in the second year you're going to do ancient history. And I'd done ancient history at Winchester, and it was all right, but I thought I didn't want to do that again. I was on the tour when I was interested in it. So I said, I don't think that can be right. But he said, no, it is right. I mean, don't push your luck. I mean, you don't know what you're doing at all. That was obviously right. And actually, ancient history is the thing that we must do, and we're going to go to the following people were going to go to Hugo Jones and Moses Finley, and they're the real thing. And you'll find that when you go to them, I mean, it'll all start to make sense. That was right, really. I mean, it did sort of all start to make sense then. Especially Moses was the most wonderful teacher, the most astonishing teacher.
Is this as a supervisor or as a lecturer or both?
Well, it was as a lecturer and as someone running seminars. I mean, he never supervised me, but he and Hugo Jones ran a sort of research seminar basically together, so it was full of other university teaching officers, and as they subsequently became, and research fellows and so on, and research students. But you were allowed to come along if you were an undergraduate, and you might have just simply said, well, we're going along too. And when you were there, I mean, you could simply join in, because it was a process of discussion, really, of thinking aloud, and it was easy to join in, even as an undergraduate, and not knowing very much. And it was incredibly exciting. And Moses gave these wonderful lectures, gave a course of lectures on slavery, which he never quite made into a single sort of dominating book, but I've never been taught by anyone else in that way. I mean, it was a really rather devastating experience, and it was inspiring. I mean, it made you feel, well, you know, it would of course come out like that, but it's really worth trying to do this, and you can't tell how far you can get until you try as hard as you can, really. That was really the big change for me as an undergraduate. It's sort of interesting in a way, in retrospect, that it was in a subject which I wouldn't have thought I wanted to do, and that it wasn't in any way directly connected with any of the things I went on to work on myself, but it just was a sort of demonstration of how to do it.
What about your third year? Were there any other people who lectured you or taught you? You come across John Saltmarsh, for instance.
Yes, no, I was taught by John Saltmarsh in my second year. I mean, he, as it were, took the Christopher Morris road in the second year. He wasn't a very directly instructive supervisor either. His lectures were more charming than
There was legends of him charging down, showing the influence of the stirrup on world civilizations with some sharp instrument which he nearly struck various undergraduates with. Was this true? Or not?
He went in for some histrionics, yes. And he had a very sort of strange, lilting voice. So actually it was quite fascinating listening to him. I was trying to think of some of the other people who taught, who did actually have quite a big impact on me. Walter Ullmann was a very good lecturer, and I was sort of excited about medieval political thought by him. I mean, much more excited about medieval political thought than about any other bit of the history of political thought. I mean, he was a much more compelling lecturer, really, than his Laslett, for example. And in my final year, I did a special subject with Duncan Forbes on the Scottish Enlightenment, and that was wonderful. But it wasn't sort of exactly didactically wonderful. It was wonderful just because there was the Scottish Enlightenment and there was Duncan Forbes, more or less part of it, except that he was wearing his kilt and wasn't completely enlightened accoutrement. But he
was wearing a kilt, you say?
Well, sort of spiritually
all
the time. I mean, sometimes literally, but not all the time literally. When he felt his colleagues demanded it of him.
But he was your first.
He was definitely a sort of a Highlander in exile, I think, in Cambridge. He often felt in exile. left Cambridge promptly as soon as the full term ended.
Mm. But it was an encounter also with the great Scottish Enlightenment thinkers, presumably.
Yes, no, it was wonderful, wonderful material. It was a very exciting passage, but and in a way, I mean, I suppose those thinkers, I mean, have been sort of on my mind ever since. So it was, in that sense, was quite a formative experience. And a lot of other people did that special subject. Quentin did it. And,
Quentin Skinner.
yes, and Mick Phillips, and people who went on to do.
Was Quentin a year older than you? Or
No, Quentin's the same age as me.
You were contemporaries, were you?
Yes.
Yeah. Were you
Same
friends when you were undergraduates? Or?
No, I didn't meet Quentin until the beginning of my third year. And I mean, for not tremendously good reasons, I'm afraid, at that point. I mean, Michael Cook, who I mentioned before, and I both got starred first, and Quentin got starred first. And, Michael said we should meet this other person who got starred first. So we did. And I don't think that would have occurred to me, but anyway, it occurred to Michael. He had a sense of seemliness rather different from mine.
Well, as we come on names in the life, even though it's much later that really your close link with Quentin occurs, all right, from now on, but he talked a bit about you in a very nice way in his interview, so I was wondering how much, in what ways he'd influenced you, or anything you'd like to say about.
Well, I think it isn't really exactly right to think of it in terms of either of us influencing the other. I mean, what's really true is that we both started off doing the history of political ideas at the same time as graduate students, and we both started off working with Peter Laslett, and we had a very high degree of intellectual sympathy about what it was that we were trying to do, and a lot of very strongly overlapping interests, and we were just companions, really. I think the model of influence is sort of slightly too instrumental, really. I mean, we sort of explored together and honed up on our sort of condescension to what other people were up to, and Peter had a series of sort of grandees to come along and talk to his graduate students, and on the whole these weren't people that we had a very high regard for, and so we gave them an extremely rough time. It was very great fun doing it together. It was a very great pleasure, and of course Quentin has always been extraordinarily fluent and polished and sort of intellectually vivid figure. So, I mean, to do something that you really very closely shared interests in together with him was a very, very great pleasure. And I mean, it certainly, in terms of sort of esprit de corps, I mean, it certainly made what might have been a rather sort of confusing and certainly in some respects what was, I suppose, quite confused sort of apprenticeship. It made it feel like just a romantic exploration, really. And I certainly think the intellectual confidence I developed about what I was trying to do, I mean, must to a very large degree come from that period. I mean, there was a bit of it before, which had come out of working very closely with Michael, because I certainly spent much more time in Michael's company and sort of worked through each other's thought processes. I mean, in much greater detail with him than I ever did with Quentin. With Quentin, we did our own research, and we talked and we gossiped and we sort of skirmished with other people. We read each other's work very carefully and thought about it and got excited by it. And it was very, very nice. I mean, the strongest thing to say about it from this distance is what a great pleasure it was, really, and how enlivening it was. The respect in which we were most closely in sort of analytical agreement was really negative in retrospect. It was over the sort of fictional and sort of rather dimly fictional character of most of what was done as the history of political ideas at that point. And we were very, we shared a common animosity really towards the way in which the history of political ideas was done in Oxford. I mean, we were very, very condescending. I mean, we knew more about it because it was easier to hear it, as it were. We knew more about the way it was done there than, as it were, might have been in Heidelberg, if you see what I mean, Paris for that matter. And perhaps we would have not liked any better if we'd been equally well informed about these other places, but we were very convinced that there was something ridiculous and about the way it was done in Oxford, and we sort of worked out together ways of expressing what we thought was misguided about it. And in retrospect, of course, there were some things about it which were completely misguided, and perhaps we could have afforded to pay slightly greater attention to them than we did. But we were on to something, I think, undoubtedly. I mean, for quite a long time, we fought a sort of common campaign, really, more or less on that front. It was quite a successful campaign, as campaigns go, and left a trace.
Who and what in Oxford exactly? I mean, you're not talking about Collingwood, because he's not really a political philosopher.
No, it would basically be Berlin and Plowmanats, I suppose. I mean, those would be the two largest figures.
What was wrong? I mean, I read both of them, but Berlin's easier to remember. I mean, what was it about Berlin's work that amused or irritated you, or you got?
I think we both thought it was frivolous, really, in the sort of intellectual sense. I mean, it was obviously politically engaged, in that sense wasn't frivolous at all. I mean, it had a purpose, all right. But we thought that it, was sort of careless and sort of unaccountable in sort of intention, really. I mean, it was just a sort of elaborate showing off from an intellectual point of view. We thought that there wasn't a product there which you could use as a reliable source of belief about anything. So in that sense, I mean, in the sort of priggish sense of history, we thought it wasn't historical at all. We just thought it was just a sort of, idle, if gifted chatter.
The higher journalism. Yes. I mean, in the lectures I went to, it turned out to be my future DPhil supervisor, Keith Thomas, and although this isn't his special field, he has published on hops and so on. Was he one of your targets, or what's your...
No, we admired him very much. but he wasn't, from our point of view, I mean, of course, it is that his work on hops is terribly good, and it's still the best of that kind there's been. I mean, we didn't think of him as being principally a historian of political thought. I mean, we thought of him as... I don't know if the category was clear in our minds in those days, but... we thought of him as a sort of social historian, as someone who was bringing the intellectual benefits of anthropology, maybe even sociology, insofar as there are such benefits, to history. And as I think both Quentin and I at that point, I mean, I don't know what Quentin thinks now about this, but don't exactly know what I think about it now, but we both at that point, I think, thought that history and the social sciences ought essentially to be the same structure. They ought to be a sort of common cognitive enterprise, and the sort of divisions within them ought to be divisions of a conventional kind rather than a substantive kind. And we thought that, perhaps rather trustingly at that point, we thought that anthropology and sociology were more, had devoted more intellectual attention to the question of whether there was good reason to believe that what they said was true or not, and that history was due for some serious remedial attention in that area. So we certainly thought of Keith Dollis as being a very intellectually advanced sort of historian, and as doing the sort of thing we would like to be doing in, as it were, our bit of the terrain, in his bit of the terrain, or in other bits of the terrain anyway.
At that period, much of history was dominated by Marxists, as you know. Much of the board, past and present, and Christopher Hill and Eric Hobsbawm, E.P. Thompson, and many others were. Did you, as a pair, or anyone else, have any particular view about the Marxist influence in history?
I don't know what Quentin thought about that really at all. We didn't talk about that as a distinct topic at exactly that point in time. I sort of blundered into it as a topic willy-nilly when I was writing about Locke, because there was the sort of Marxist sort of owner of Locke at the time, Ralph McPherson, Canadian political theorist. And I thought McPherson was an interesting man in some ways, but he was very badly wrong about Locke. And I had to sort of begin by pointing out that he was very badly wrong.
In what way was he wrong?
Well, essentially he didn't understand how Locke's theory worked, because he had a model which showed how it must have worked, and the model just simply blanked out quite a lot of the way it did work. And if you tried to work it on his model, it just didn't work. That was so in a sense it was a Passmore phrase. It was telling men of straw that they have no brains. Exercise. It was he invented, as it were, Locke's theory through his model, and then pointed out that it didn't work as a theory through his model, but actually it did pretty much work as a theory through its model, and I was just pointing that out, really. I was quite, for sort of political reasons, I suppose, I was quite well disposed towards Marxist historians, because I felt that they were sort of wearing my sort of colours. And insofar as I was really interested in Marxism, I was interested in how it came out in relation to contemporary politics, and my judgment at that point on that was it didn't come out terribly well in relation to contemporary politics. Not that, as it were, any counterpart came out sort of majestically better, but I just thought that, these people have a much higher degree of belief than is warranted, and it's not. If you're going to understand contemporary politics, you've just got to try harder than that. Stop pretending some of what I thought they were pretending. So I wasn't sort of intellectually very convinced by Marxism at any point, but I was very sympathetic to Marxists who were historians, because they principally worked on the sorts of topics I was interested in myself, and principally, obviously, align themselves with the sorts of forces that I would naturally align myself with. So it was a sort of quite ingenuous type of sympathy, really. Later on, in different bits of my work, I had to think quite seriously about Marxism in the respects in which it didn't work. But I didn't really bother to think about it hard, I mean, intellectually, until later.
Was this when you wrote on revolutions, or?
Yes, it was when I wrote on revolutions and when I started working on the politics of Africa. And I mean, I suppose more or less from then on till now, until when I started to think about my socialist politics, weren't very successful. And I tried to think, going back to the Scottish Enlightenment, when I tried to think my way through, I mean, exactly what sorts of economic limits there really now are to politics, and where those have come from, and how constraining they are, and exactly what they consist in, and so on. I mean, all of those are subject matters where, in a way, I mean, Marxism, I mean, has a definite location, and I mean, what's sort of real or substantial in it, and what's sort of fantastical and sort of deeply misguiding, I mean, matter a great deal. So I had to try and think about how it came out. I mean, I had to audition it properly in respect to those, but I didn't really audition it very seriously until, I suppose, until the 1970s, really.
After you'd got your start first, is that when you went and started to work on Locke with Peter Laslett?
Yes, I mean, I didn't initially intend to work on Locke himself. I intended to do, in fact, I actually initially intended to work on Hume with Duncan Forbes, but he didn't think that was a good idea. And he thought it would be much better to do something about what happened more strictly in relation to the history of political ideas between Locke and, loosely speaking, the French and American revolutions, and in some sort of deal between the two of them. I mean, they agreed that what I should do instead of working on Hume with Duncan was to go and work with Peter on what happened to the two treatises in the subsequent century, really, and that's what I was supposed to be writing a PhD about. And I did do quite a lot of research on that, and it was quite interesting in some bits of it, what happened. But I mean, what I found in the research was that less happened than I'd been led to believe by all the secondary sources, and that the really interesting bits could be located quite fast, and their interest, I mean, could be reasonably effectively captured quite fast, and that whereas, as it were, turning it into a completely bulletproof PhD would have required extensive documentation of non-happening. And I thought, this is not going to be a rewarding exercise. And partly that I went to America, I got a Harkness fellowship, and I went to Harvard after doing a couple of years of research here. And partly because I'd been given a teaching job in Jesus by Moses Finley. Things were more patrimonial in those days. But, I'd already got this fellowship to go to America, and I bargained my way into retaining the teaching job, provided I didn't go to America for the full time that I could have. And I went to Harvard for about a year and a quarter, I suppose, altogether. And I did the American bit of the research, which I thought might turn out to be much more interesting, so it might have meant there was enough there to be worthwhile doing as a PhD, but it didn't really turn out that way in my judgment. So I thought, well, I've got this job, and I've seen something really interesting about Locke himself, which wasn't understood by people at the time. What I better do is I better come back and write that as a book, and maybe that will do for a PhD. But anyway, I mean, it's certainly more worthwhile to write as a book. there was a lot of academic employment in those years.
Is this the late 60s?
Yes, I mean it's the second half of the 60s essentially.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, I didn't expect to be able to go on working in Cambridge because I didn't really want to go on being a historian. I wanted definitely to work on politics, and I thought there weren't any jobs in politics really. I mean, there was one lectureship in the History of Political Thought which Quentin had, and I thought, well, that's it really. There aren't going to be any more of those in my period. He's going to do that, and there wasn't a politics department or anything resembling it, so I thought I'd have to go somewhere else sooner or later. But I had first of all this job in Jesus, and then I came back to King's on the understanding that I would become Director of Studies extremely shortly after I got here. And ease some of my teachers into, yes, in history, ease some of my teachers into retirement. I was keen to come back to King's. I didn't really like Jesus. It was a really right-wing institution in those days, and it didn't really suit me at all. But and it's quite completely different now. It was very right-wing in those days. Dennis Page, the master, was the lone British, sort of prominent anyway, British supporter of the Greek colonels, and that gave you the general political timbre of the college pretty well. I wasn't at home in that company. And Moses and Raymond Williams, who of course was also a fellow of Jesus, just never came to the college, right? So they didn't really, I mean, they ignored all this. But I as a very young teaching fellow, I was economically tied to the college quite adhesively, and I just didn't like being there. I was very keen to get somewhere else.
John, you came under the supervision of Peter Laslett. Tell me something about Peter.
Peter was a very nice person to work with, and he was he conveyed many of his very many enthusiasms very effectively to the people he was teaching. And he liked you to go along and sit with him and admire his books and listen to.
Of which he had many John Locke.
He had lots of wonderful 17th century books. And, he was at that point in time. I mean, obviously he was starting off to do work mostly on the history of population, and he was very enthusiastic about that. But he hadn't lost the enthusiasm he'd had for his researches on Locke, and for him those researches really consisted of a sort of lengthy adventure story. I mean, they had sort of intellectual pretensions too, but the central thread, red line running through the middle of them, was the story of an intellectual adventure, which was also often a social adventure. I mean, it sort of overlapped a bit with the Aspern papers, but it was he wanted very much to convey and pass on to the people he was teaching a sort of zest for the trail, for following the trail, and he wanted to relive, the excitements of his own chase.
This was finding Locke's library.
Well, that was one of the high points. Recited probably not more than 40 or 50 times, hearing at varying lengths. But that was an example of many others, of just a big, grand, and consequential example of many others. And he was always very interested in relations with persons and how those had come out in relation to following the trail. And that's why the stories were good stories on the whole. So there were lots of stories about Paul Mellon, who'd been a very important figure from his point of view, and on whom he had quite a lot of practical influence. I mean, he persuaded to buy a very large chunk of what left behind that was on the market at one point, and of several different points, and transport it off to the Bodleian eventually. So that side of working with him, I'm sure it had counterparts with other historians. I think maybe Jack Plum, perhaps, when he was trying to encourage his graduate students to insinuate themselves into the affections of noble families who would have the papers they'd require. I mean, may have approached the matter in a rather similar spirit, but and actually they had more in common temperamentally in that respect than you'd guess, really, because they were pretty unlike each other in most other respects. But they both prided themselves on the capacity to get other people to do what they wanted, and they could both turn that capacity, as it were, in retrospect, into very good stories. Indeed, I mean, Peter had continuing intellectual interests, which, I mean, varied in interest from my point of view, and some of them I was very, very interested in myself, and some of them I really wasn't interested in at all. And I mean, he did operate on a very broad front. I mean, his intellectual interests were very diverse, really. And I suppose he conveyed, I mean, the aspect of working with him which made it very much an apprenticeship was that he conveyed a sense of how you did the work and what it was like to do the work. I mean, he conveyed a sort of life world sense of what it was, and he attempted to induct you into that life world, and that involved going in to have lunch at Trinity and being introduced to great figures from the intellectual history of the 20th century, with whom you might not immediately have, I mean, much in the way of small talk comfortably in common. Piero Sraffa and E.H. Carr and so on. But it was quite exciting, and the people he had come to his sort of graduate seminar, that's slightly too formal a description of what it was, I mean, a group of graduate students meeting to discuss with these visiting grandees in his room. They were diverse, and some of them were very impressive people, some of them less impressive. But, I mean, he certainly suggested opening horizons. He suggested you could pursue your own intellectual interests, and you could have a very good time, and you could travel the world, and you know, the horizons reached a very long way out, and that was all very nice. He talked about his different current intellectual enthusiasms with great zest, and he listened to what you had to say. I mean, not for a very large proportion of the time, but for enough of the time to be sort of gratifying and encouraging. And on the whole, I mean, he was enthusiastic about what his students had to say. So I don't know if he had any very, very, very loquacious students with no brains at all. But anyway, he was always very supportive in that respect as a supervisor. He was pretty inattentive in some sort of technical didactic sense. I mean, he didn't necessarily think terribly hard about arguments that you'd written down, and he didn't necessarily read your work at just the right point in time or anything like that. I mean, so he lived in a sort of whirl of chaos, as he goes himself. So the chaos, I mean, that was part of all the agreeable side, but it wasn't obviously completely satisfactory from a transactional, educational point of view always. But he was very... I didn't myself think that in relation to some of his intellectual interests, I mean, he really understood matters very deeply and sort of steadily, but he was extraordinarily good on Locke. It wasn't just that he'd done some rather dashing archival research and established, or more or less established, some sort of striking historical fact which people were previously unaware of about Locke. I think it was also that he really did have a very good feel for what Locke was like and what sorts of things he was actually preoccupied with. And I think hermeneutically he was very skilled really with Locke. And that made him a very nice person to talk about Locke with. And I mean, the best bits from my point of view of working with him were definitely the bits in which I was working sort of frontally on Locke, because there, I mean, he was extremely instructive and very, very helpful. On what was initially supposed to be my PhD, I mean, he was more sporadically informed and therefore considerably less helpful. And I suppose, I mean, one of the things which was nice about working with him is that he treated his pupils as though they were more or less the same age as him. And it didn't actually take very long as his pupil before you came to the conclusion that in certain respects he was more or less right in so doing. Not in that they were all sort of intellectually as far advanced in their explorations as he was, but in the sense that he was a very sort of incontinent person. I mean, he wasn't perfectly in control of anything. And what made him very suggestive and very exciting to talk about things with was, in a sense, the sort of impulsiveness and immediacy of his responses. I think it probably is right to say that he actually got really further with Locke before he signed off than he did probably with anything else that he did intellectually in his life. So, in a way, that was the peak of his capabilities, and it was very, very fully present, really, if you were working with him. And I think I must definitely have enjoyed working with him much more than Quentin did, for example. I think Quentin always operated very much in his own terms, and those terms can't have overlapped very much with Peter's in some respects. And I think Quentin was more sort of deeply impatient with the chaos, really. I think he didn't... I really rather liked the chaos, except when it imposed direct costs on me at a particular point. I mean, I found it charming. He was a very charming person, Peter, when he was trying to be. And he, with his graduate students, he almost always was trying to be. Now, I'm not always trying to be charming with my graduate students, quite apart from the question of capability. And actually, I think most people aren't consistently trying to be charming with their graduate students. They have other things to do with them for some of the time anyway. But Peter, in a way, almost never had anything more urgent to do with his graduate students than to be charming with them. And so he sort of caught you up in a common spiral of slightly frivolous enjoyment, which at the same time was very, very instructive, in retrospect. It showed you a great deal. It was a very un-Puritan bit of education, really. But it was very educative, and it certainly made me like him very much indeed. And I was always very fond of him from a few weeks into starting to work with him as a graduate student. And I didn't know him at all before. I went to a few of his lectures, which were very beforehand, but I didn't know him at all. So it could have been not a nice experience. But it was a very nice experience. I'm very grateful for it.
Yes, well, it all accords with what Sarah, my wife, and I feel about him, too. We miss him very much. every time we go past Clarkson Road, our faces fall and we say, "Oh, Peter, where is he now?" Coming back to King's, you came back and became a teaching fellow and director of studies. It was just before I came. Are there any people in King's who would be nice to talk about? I think Edmund was probably provost when you came, was he, or was it the end of Noel?
It was Noel who imported me, but Edmund who was sort of on the throne when I arrived. I mean, I didn't know Edmund well, but I liked Edmund very much too. I mean, actually Edmund was terrible to start off with. There was about 6 months of complete chaos when he was hopelessly out of control and therefore in an absolutely filthy temper. And the college couldn't cope with such a very large, very angry man, especially in that role. So there was a bad patch, and very few people would stand up to him because they were so frightened by the bad temper. British aren't very good in the face of bad temper. I mean, I disapproved of some things that he did at that point quite a lot, but I mean, that was quite a brief interlude in retrospect, and I mean, he became an extraordinarily good provost, I think. There's no doubt about it at all. I mean, he became a convincing intellectual leader of an institution that is incredibly supercilious about the idea of being led intellectually. But he actually, as a sort of social role, I mean, he brought it off completely, I think. And he made it an exciting place to be in. I mean, Noel conveyed a tremendous sense of sort of occasion and stage presence and all the rest of it. But I mean that looked, to me anyway, sort of pretty illusory. I mean, there were bits of what actually had happened in the college under him which perhaps fitted the bill. But his sense of occasion and my sense of occasion hardly overlapped at all. So I thought it was sort of empty and bombastic. I mean, the picture of the college as a sort of grand intellectual stage at that point, which he was incessantly purveying. But it sort of began to become, I mean, simply true for me under Edmund's provostship, and I think, I mean, in some ways the sequence from Edmund to Bernard was distinctive, because Bernard was so sort of dashingly, publicly clever whenever he felt like it, that he, I mean, in a way, you had to resist him not to, I think, succumb to that. But I mean, with Edmund, it was more impulsive, and in some respects, I mean, it was sort of existentially rather denser than it was with Bernard. And I think Edmund made the college into a sort of rather odd sort of social whole in a way that Bernard certainly didn't. I mean, Bernard was much more detached and individualist, and you know, his own person, irrespective of whether or not he happened to be provost at the time. But Edmund, in a way, sort of became provost, and I thought he did it wonderfully, really, in retrospect. This figure, if you like, initially, I must say, as I said, I very much disapproved, because he behaved so disgracefully, really, for a bit. I came to be very fond of too.
Well, those were the glory days when I, as I remember them, when I first came to the fellowship electors, when you ran a competition, and then I came as a research fellow, and the research electors were a very star-studded group, weren't they, at that time, with Sydney and later Martin Rees and so on and so on. but which of the fellows have really become friends, or you would like to talk about it at all? I mean, one could go through the list, but
well, there are people I've been very involved with because of their role in the college as an institution, I suppose, and some of them are nothing at all to do with my subject, however you construe it. I mean, Martin Hyland, for example, I've become very fond of Martin, and we've sort of fought in a lot of different campaigns together, almost invariably unavailingly, but I mean, I wouldn't regret any of the campaigns, and I've certainly come to think very well and to feel very warmly about him in that context. There are a small number of people who take college in a way sort of perhaps slightly ludicrously seriously and have exaggerated the high goals for it or requirements of it, fantasies of it, and he's certainly been one of the people in my time here of whom that's been true. And, I think it is definitely true that college, as of now, I mean, is a somewhat depleted version of what it was in the glory days. And I think it is true that you can understand the process of depletion in a sort of causal way, I mean, fairly coherently. So there was there was a real battle going on over that period of time, but whether or not people who reigned on different sides had very good judgments about what it would be a good idea to do or a bad idea to do. Everyone's judgment is fairly erratic, and most of these matters are imponderable at the time in question. People get very angry with each other and so on. So, I mean, it's probably a messy story if we go over it with any care, but I would say that from that, across that period of time, I mean, Martin Hyland is one of the people I felt closest to, really. I mean, there are people I'm close to because of the overlap with my own work in different ways. Probably Istvan Hunt is the person I'm closest to from that point of view, because like you, he came to King's as a senior research fellow and to work on a project in the research centre, which, as it happens, was on loosely speaking the Scottish Enlightenment. Why that's the basis of modern wisdom about the world, and so far as there is any such thing. And I mean, he certainly, he came from quite a long way away, and a very distinctive sort of political experience. His father was a minister in the communist government in Hungary, and he came as a sort of intellectually compulsive anti-Marxist, and he came, in a sense, to reassert the Scottish Enlightenment against the errors of what came later, really, downstream. And I've learned a great deal from him in relation to many things that I'm interested in. And as a personal relation, I mean, it's had its ups and downs, but I mean, intellectually, it's been extraordinarily instructive for me. I mean, I've learned an enormous amount from it. Probably, in a sense, professionally, I've learned more from him than I have from anyone else in the last 25 years or so. 30 years or so. I suppose it's important that my principal interests are in what's been happening to the world politically, and why it's been happening to the world politically, and what it means. Cambridge isn't a terrifically good place to think about those questions, because there aren't very many people around here with a lot of expertise in relation to the very large number of different bits of the potential answer to them. And I mean, this one has turned out to be more of a resource in relation to trying to think systematically about those questions than anyone else has here over that period of time. But I mean, there are lots of other things which Cambridge is very wonderful for, and some of those are serviceable. I've had lots of nice relationships with people about different areas of intellectual interest, but they haven't sort of made as deep an indentation in my life, probably, as this one has. And in relation to the college, as I say, I don't really think anybody else probably has been sort of consistently imaginatively in sympathy with me, or my views consistently imaginatively in sympathy with about the college as Martin. I mean, I've had a lot of, over lots of things I've agreed obviously with lots of people, but there are people I've been very glad to be a fellow alongside in many different ways over that period of time. I could make a long list. Martin Rees, Carrie
Humphrey.
Yes. Pete de Boller, I mean, very assorted people. But I mean, none of those people really have actually had a big effect on the way in which I think about things. And I wouldn't say any of them had I wouldn't say I in a sense, thought and felt about college in the same sort of way as any of them over a long period of time, really. I mean, there's something which is potentially of interest, I think, about the sort of tie you have to a college if, like me, you've come to it very much by accident, and it's established the practical framework in which you could begin to build an adult life. And I was a feudal dependent in a sense of the college for quite a long time, in a way that most university teachers are, sort of bourgeois dependents of bits of quite large institutions that are not very sort of domestic kind, which have a structure that comes from partly from the government and partly from the sort of proliferating requirements of the quest for knowledge and so on. But I mean, colleges are very much more domestic sort of site than that. And if it's your primary relation to a university city, you have a different sense of belonging in the city than you have if you're a university teaching officer that comes from somewhere else and draws a proper salary on a proper normal basis, like any other member of the sort of professionalised bureaucratic workforce. I think it's both more menial and more intimate, the relationship you have to a college, and as the roles change over time, I mean, the sense of the menial side of it drops away a bit, but the sort of personal tie side of it doesn't drop away really, and that's very involving. I mean, it's meant that King's has consumed a lot more of my emotion and probably quite a lot more of my time than there was any instrumentally good reason for it to do so. And I mean, certainly my wife thinks that that's an occasion for regret, but I can't pretend I feel it's an occasion for regret myself.
And that is partly referring to when you came as a NUTO, as they call them now, non-university teaching officer for some years, and then you got assistant lectureship in SPS, is that right? And then you became a lecturer.
Lectureship in SPS.
Lectureship, and then you didn't become a reader, you went straight to a
No, I became a reader about 5 years after that.
Oh.
Horror of the history faculty.
and then you became professor.
And then I became professor later, yes.
In passing, you said something about Cambridge is a very good place for many things, and you mentioned that meeting people who weren't necessarily in your subject. Are there other things about the university which you feel, because I'm interested in what ways it contributes to our intellectual creativity and so on, there are other ways in which you think it's a good university to be in?
I think there are very simple and very drastically important respects in which it's good to be in. It is very good to teach in a place in which you can be certain that they're constantly going to be arriving very, very clever 18-year-olds. I mean, that is a terrific benefit if you want to live an intellectual life. It's sort of constant rejuvenation process to some degree to be successful, but then nothing would be. But insofar as anything could be, probably that's the best possibility. And of course it is also in some respects a very parochial place in all sorts of ways, but in some respects also extremely cosmopolitan in the sense that it's that people come to it from all over the world constantly and come in some sense in hope. I think that has been very important for me. I mean, it's a very easy place in which to maintain intellectual friendships with people right across the world, and quite an easy place in which to form intellectual friendships with people from a very long way away. And I would say it was as propitious from those points of view as it is for forming intellectual friendships across disciplines inside the university. I think it is a very, very big thing that if you are a fellow of a college for decades, I've been a fellow of this college for more than 40 years now, you're just guaranteed to have, unless you have no friends at all, you're guaranteed to have friends who are in disciplines a very long way away from your own. And that is a very good thing in the modern academic world, or just the modern world. I mean, it's very enabling, that, I think. And if you contrast it with the experience of teaching in a not very optimistic provincial university in this country now, you can see that it's really hard for people to have it's quite hard for people to have an interesting intellectual life, really, on the basis of their employment. I mean, some people will have such a life unstoppably wherever they are, but if you're ordinarily dependent in that respect, I mean, it makes an enormous difference if, in fact, you're constantly talking to people who really do know about completely different things and will see aspects of the world and present themselves to you in a really different way from you, because they simply know about different relevant considerations. And I think it's very, very good to be, the contrast between being a fellow of a college in Oxford or Cambridge and a member of a disciplinary department in most British universities is a tremendous contrast in opportunity. I'm very conscious of that. I mean, that's made a huge difference.
I mean, you spent some time in America. Have you ever been tempted to leave Cambridge and go to America? You must have had offers, or even Japan.
I did consider going, in a sense, in bad temper at a certain point under Mrs. Thatcher. I had a very, very nice time when I was in America in the mid-1960s, on the Harkness at Harvard, and sort of wandering around the United States. I like going back to America usually quite a lot, and I've taught in several other American universities. I've taught at Yale, and I'm going back to teach there briefly in the near future, and I've taught at Tulane, which is a very weird institution because of an extraordinary city. But it's and I've taught in the University of Minnesota for a bit. And I quite like being in different bits of America, but I would be more dismayed at the thought of going there and staying there now than I would have been when I first went there, because in some respects, I mean, the America I first went to was at its most sort of Europe-friendly and social democracy-friendly in its entire history. And it's moved back, from my point of view, a very long way, and it's actually a very long way from that since. And I find it very much less attractive now. I find it politically offensive, really, in ways that what was offensive about it in the mid-1960s, in a sense, was clearly, as it were, simply a consequence of the history it had had. And in that sense, was not unequivocally, at that point in time, its fault. It was its fate. But I feel that since then, I mean, it's really regressed as a civilization in important respects. I mean, it's chosen harsher and, in some respects, I think, stupider sort of social and economic shape. And it's adopted a series of policies in relation to the rest of the world, which I very strongly disapprove in many respects. And I think it's a less desirable aspect of the world, and of course it's a very large and consequential aspect of the world, so the shift, I mean, matters tremendously to lots of other people, most other people actually, in some respects. So I wouldn't really like to go there. I mean, if you think of moving there as a sort of quasi-civic transition, the idea of shifting civically towards the United States, it would be very unattractive.
We've talked somewhat of the college. But you've been involved also quite centrally in the faculty of social and political sciences, and you were chairman and so on. That's had a not uniformly easy time. I mean, I came when John Barnes was head of something which wasn't really a faculty, but then you had Anthony Giddens and so on. Well, Tony Giddens is someone you might have some views about.
I have lots of views about Tony, yes. He was a terrible colleague, and he can be a very nice companion. He's a very, very clever, very fluent person, and he has extraordinary energy. And the fact that those characteristics were present in someone who was a terrible colleague really wrecked about 7 or 8 years of my life. So I was very, very hostile to him for a lot of that time. I mean, not sort of completely in the round ever, because the companion charm came through whenever he wanted it to. And if
was this ideologically, or?
It was actually, I would say, educationally. I mean, ideologically, we're not all that far apart. I mean, I think many of his sort of enunciated ideological views are pretty fatuous, but they're not sort of intensely objectionable. I mean, they're not sort of wildly and deeply wrong. I mean, they're just sort of vague and vapid, I think. So it's not. I don't have a deep problem with them. I just have a problem taking them entirely seriously. But I mean, we were very often in conflict about what to do about the social and political sciences faculty, and almost invariably in conflict about what to do about the presence of politics in that faculty. And of course we were both sort of rats in too small a cage, really. We were both stuck with a setting in which university, a grand research university, had set up our subjects on such a small scale that they really couldn't be done satisfactorily, and we were both constantly therefore having to decide what to do about that. and in practice, I mean, that largely translated into disagreements about who most urgently needed another job. And of course, that nobody is that most presentable in relation to that sort of topic, disagreement. But I mean, what I found very difficult with Tony, and in that setting, and mattered a great deal in that setting, in ways it probably didn't when he was running LSE, was that he would never consider a question of that kind on the basis of some articulated and accountable view of what was educationally needed. I mean, he just didn't deal in those categories at all. He dealt with it entirely as a sort of positional game of appropriation. And I couldn't really deal with that. I mean, I didn't, it offended me. And also it exhausted me. And in retrospect, exhaustion seems much more important than the offence. And that's all sort of energy gone. But
another person who, well, someone else you've worked with is Sandy Robertson, who wrote a book with Sandy. How did that happen?
well, that was a real fluke, but it was a very nice fluke from my point of view, and I don't think it really did have Sandy much harm. I mean, he was, I mean, that happened, it goes back to the college, I mean, how it happened. It happened because I was very keen to go and look at a part of the post-colonial world reasonably carefully. I thought that I wanted to do political theory on what was happening now, and I thought that political theory somehow should think about categories which, I mean, unless they're very deep and imaginative people, should think about categories that are relatively novel and sort of reasonably extensively instantiated, because that will give them at least some chance of seeing something which other people haven't already seen, which is really there. And I thought post-colonial states, there are lots of post-colonial states, there weren't any post-colonial almost no post-colonial states in 1944. There were lots and lots of post-colonial states by the late 1960s, and I thought, and the American political science and sort of political sociology obviously didn't have a clue really about them at that point. I mean, we were talking complete nonsense about them. And I thought this is something that's a very important bit of world politics, and it's not being well understood. And I must get myself to one of these places and take a proper look at it, and then I'll be able to think in a slightly more consecutive and potentially helpful way about it. And, but I couldn't see how I could without losing my sort of feudal status, I mean employment. And what happened providentially was that the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Ghana, a sort of former classics PhD, a student of the college, came to the college and said that any fellow of the college could come and teach at his university for a year whenever they felt like it, hoping that sort of floods of molecular biologists and mathematicians and so on would stream off in that direction. But of course none of those actually wanted to. And I very, very much wanted to go somewhere, I mean, of which Ghana was an example, somewhere which was definitely a post-colonial state. And it was an interesting time to go to Ghana from that point of view, because it was under the first post-Nkrumah government, and Nkrumah sort of pioneered post-colonial states in Africa, so it would be a big historical item. And it was a military and police regime, so it wasn't going to last for very long at that point. And its advertisement for itself was that it was its very temporary character. And I thought that this would be a really good place to go to, and furthermore I can go there without getting sacked, so I should do so. So I did. And about 3 or 4 months, I suppose, before I went, I mean, I learned that possibly it was Jack Goody who told me, I don't remember, but I learnt that there was a postdoctoral student in Cambridge, Sandy Robertson, who was going to work in Ghana for a couple of years. I mean, I've got the date slightly wrong, but anyway, for about that period of time, on a project on Ghanaian local government, and Jack suggested that perhaps he and I might cooperate in some way in this research, and I met him, and we agreed that we would indeed cooperate, and I said that what I was interested in really was understanding what's happening politically now. And obviously it would be very special to have an opportunity to have some sort of real access to that, somewhere, some distance away from the capital. I said in return I would do what was required in the Public Record Office and in, maybe the National Archives in Accra, to try to fathom what was happening on the political scene in relation to this place from the centre, and we would put together, what we learned from these two exercises and see how much sense we could make out of it. And essentially what happened practically was that Sandy went and worked there in the forest about 250 miles from Accra for quite a long time. And I taught in the university, and in the vacations I went to see him in this setting, and he sort of showed me around and established various relations with people. Then when he went back again, which was I suppose about 4 or 5 months before I went back to Cambridge, he simply handed over to me his habitat in full working order, which was a terrific help practically. And so I did. I spent several months, consecutively working there at the end. And in between I sort of went up and down a great deal while he was still there, and indeed after he'd gone, to try and get some sense of what was going on at the time in this area. And he was working on local government and therefore on the relationship between sort of modern local government institutions and chieftaincy, which was very intricate and partly fraught and partly cooperative. And when he came back again, he was very meticulous and orderly, sadly. Anyway, he's sort of record keeping. I've never been that. But I did do a lot of work, which was for that really, and as much, certainly at least as much, it was for that as was for, in any direct sense, for the reason that I'd initially gone there. And when I came back, and he was working away on his material, we talked about whether we actually could write a book together, and we decided that actually it might work quite well to write something together. He was a very good person to cooperate with, very unlike me, in that he could take decisions and stick to the decisions that he'd taken and implement them effectively. And so he was a very sort of anchoring person to work with. I had just about, I suppose I had about 5 months or so from the time that I actually got the, 5 or 6 months from the time I actually got the university job in SPS, before I had to start teaching. Between the time I knew I'd got it and the time I actually had to start teaching. And in that time, I had enough time to write my half of the book. It's a big book, by my standards anyway. I mean, my bit of it is longer than any other book I've written. And we wrote roughly half each, I think, in the end. And it's the sort of book which it's not easy to explain what genre it belongs to, because it doesn't particularly belong to any pre-established genre, and it didn't create a genre, so you have to explain what on earth you think it is. But it did give, in a way, a picture of what had happened to one bit of Africa from before colonial power was established, through colonial rule and out the other end, as a sort of single interpretative structure. And at that point, I mean, that was an unusual thing to do in African studies. I think lots of people try to do that now, but people weren't really trying to do that then. And the people who, I mean, neither historians nor political scientists, nor actually even anthropologists were trying to do exactly that. And I mostly, when I was working on African politics, I spent much more time and intellectually speaking, socialising with anthropologists than I did with any other discipline, because they were on their own more help. But I mean, that book certainly isn't in any straightforward sense a work of anthropology. I mean, you can see that half of it's written by someone who has been an anthropologist, but I don't think you would say exactly it's a piece of anthropology. And it certainly isn't exactly a piece of history, and it even more certainly isn't a piece of political science, whatever that is. But it is an attempt to do something which, in a way, people might actually want done. And I have a sort of hunch, I suppose, still, that if Ghanaian from the right bit of the country wanted to get some sense of what had happened, which was essentially to be text-derived, I mean, they might as well start there as start anywhere else at all, really. I mean, I think it was quite a success in its own rather odd terms. And, I mean, Sandy went on to do quite a number of different sorts of things subsequently, and he, I mean, I think his inclination was to do things which were both a bit more theoretical than that, perhaps quite a lot more theoretical than it, and a bit more sort of practical in implication than that. And actually, it isn't at all a theoretical book, and it doesn't have any practical implications. But except, for God's sake, be careful what you do if you're trying to reinvent the institutional apparatus of a society in real time.
Turning back to your own work, I mean, recently you've published one or more books on democracy. Has it a future, or is there anything you feel you'd like to say about that theme in your work on democracy?
Well, I've been in a way trying to think about politics the whole way through, in terms of a sort of balancing between sort of potentially delusory hope and the recognition of what actually does happen in politics and why it does. I mean, some sort of effort to face up to political causality. And I became interested in democracy for two rather different reasons, one of which goes back to Moses Finley and the other of which goes back to Ghana, essentially. In the case of Moses, I mean, Moses just, one of the things that Moses taught was how to think about Athenian democracy and how to think about today through thinking about Athenian democracy. I mean, he just did that and put it exactly like that from the educational presentation, but that's what he was doing. And that instruction went home very far, and it's made the whole way through my career sort of teaching about politics, I've had some rather confident and relatively, in relation to other contemporaries, I mean, independent intuitions about democracy as a subject. And I'd been, I mean, recurrently very interested in it, and I, initially not for any sort of very peremptory reason, but I've come back to it a number of times, and I got very interested in it in one very important respect, which is still very pertinent indeed today, when I was working in Ghana, because I was trying to understand what was so toxic about the character of a post-colonial state, and about what the prospects were for sort of detoxifying it. And obviously democracy is the current, as it were, practical formula for at least attempting that task. And obviously there are some special difficulties about implementing democracy successfully in African countries. I mean, I think that is on record inductively now. And I was thinking as hard as I could about that. I mean, through the 1970s and into the early 1980s, and I sort of stopped that essentially because I didn't go on going back to Ghana, and I didn't go on going back to Ghana because it had been sort of wrecked by the military criminals who hijacked it at one point. I came back to thinking about democracy, I mean, much more casually in a way, and when I was trying to see how to join up what I thought I had learnt about democracy in the ancient world from Moses to what had happened to the category across the rest of history, and I just put together a sort of composite work of other people's efforts, I mean, about what actually had happened. But the point of doing so was to try to ask what connection, if any, there is between what happened in Athens and what's happening now. And I might have sort of given up at that point. I wouldn't necessarily have gone back to it, because most of what I've been thinking about in relation to other places, I mean, hasn't really been essentially about democracy until quite recently. But I was pulled back to it really by the judgment that there was that democracy was a much more consequential orientating category in politics in the aftermath of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that what is politically problematic about it, which in a sense always was politically problematic about it, is therefore pretty central to what's politically problematic about a lot of societies in the world today. Not all, but a lot of societies. And there is a sort of sense in which I think it's probably right to say that what's problematic about it is sort of coming to all societies sooner or later now. Unless there's some sort of very drastic process of deglobalization for ecological or bellicose reasons. I mean, obviously, some of these processes could be put smartly into reverse, and if they're put smartly enough into reverse, heaven alone knows where you'll end up. So I can't guess about that any better than anyone else. But assuming that doesn't actually happen for a bit anyway, which I think is a fairly sensible assumption, I think that you have to think the politics of most countries in the world today in some respect through the category of democracy, or in a sense over against the category of democracy. It's just sort of part of the primary structuring of what there is to understand. And I thought that I would try and see if I could show people why that was so. And so the last book that I wrote, I mean, was an attempt to do that. And in some ways it's a much more offhand looking book than I meant it to be initially. But in another respect, which I think is important, is it's a much more consequential book than I expected it to be initially, because I think what that book shows is that the way in which professional students of politics think the category of democracy today is actually incoherent in a very deep way. That there's something about their sort of basic intellectual equipment which prevents them from thinking clearly about what's supposed to be their central object of study. And since the same sort of potential obstruction is there in a way for practicing politicians potentially, I mean, outside very immediate political contexts, I mean, if their time horizons more than a few years or two, you know, if it reaches well beyond Harold Wilson's week, I think there's something really important in that book, which sort of bears directly on real political decision making now. And it's I was always convinced in Ghana that it would be a mistake for Ghana to opt for deliberately for a political structure which wasn't democratic in the minimal sense of the term, in which a modern sort of representative electoral system is. But I was also very nervously aware that the conflictual potentialities of that sort of structure in a society like Ghana are very high, and it's going to be a continuing practical political challenge for political agents to handle those conflictual possibilities for the better rather than for the worse. So I've been thinking about those issues in a way, I mean, sort of centrally or very peripherally ever since. And when I do think about sort of major issues in politics of anywhere, I mean, they tend to come back pretty prominently and quite fast. And I guess I think that it's become rather sort of obviously true in the last 3 or 4 years that this is actually a sort of central hazard space in contemporary human life. I mean, we are all, as it were, acutely vulnerable because of what is problematic in this space, and because of the increasingly obvious practical judgment that there's no other alternative space of a safer kind into which we can step and just be secure. So I think I think I've got, pretty accidentally, and certainly not with any sort of, on the basis of any personal discernment, onto a very important trail. And I suppose I now think that the work I've been doing on different aspects of world politics over the last sort of 35 years or so has turned out to be important. I didn't do it because I thought it was likely to turn out to be important, and I didn't particularly think it had turned out to be important so well recently, but I now actually think it has turned out to be important. And I suppose I'm sort of going on now from what I perceive to be its importance, rather than from the different sorts of intuitions that have grown on me along the way.
Yeah, well, I put you to 2 hours and over 2 hours of fascinating talk, and we're now on a trail which will take you, if you're anywhere near Jack Goody, for another 20 or 30 years of further production and so on. So this is a midpoint interview, John, but thank you. I think we perhaps ought to let you off now, so thank you very much indeed for that.
Well, thank you very much, Alan. It's been very interesting.